I'm live. As winter drew on, Molly became more and more troublesome. She was late for work every morning and excused herself by saying that she had overslept, and she complained of mysterious pains, although her appetite was excellent. On every kind of pretext, she would her own reflection in the water. There were also rumors of something more serious. One day, as Molly strolled blithely into the yard, flirting her long tail and showing a stalk of hay, Clover took her aside. "Molly," she said, "I've something very serious to tell you." Not do a. Shut. "Molly," she said, "I have something very serious to say to you. This morning I saw you looking over the hedge that divides Animal Farm from Foxwood. One of Mr. Pilkington's men was standing on the other side of the hedge and was a long way away, but I am almost certain I saw this. He was talking to you, and you were allowing him to stroke your nose. What does that mean, Molly?" "He did not. It wasn't me. It isn't true. This is a bad situation to be in right now. There's a piece of bread on my table. Where is it? One sec. It's the book tips. Alright, boys, crisis averted. You definitely did not just see my hair. We're back. Shut. Cried Molly, beginning to prance about and paw the ground. "Molly, look at me in the face. Do you give me your word of honor that that man was not stroking your nose?" "It is not true," repeated Molly, but she could not look Clover in the face. The next moment she took to her heels and galloped away into the field. It sucks at working. A thought struck Clover. Without saying anything to the others, she went to Molly's stall and turned over the straw with her hoof. Hidden under the straw were a little pile of lump sugar and several bunches of ribbon of different colors. SMH. 3 days later, Molly disappeared. For some weeks, nothing was known of her whereabouts. Then the pigeons reported that they had seen her on the other side of Willingdon. She was between the shafts of a smart dog cart painted red and black, which was standing outside a public house. A fat, red-faced man in check breeches and gaiters, who looked like a publican, was stroking her nose and feeding her with sugar. Her coat was newly clipped, and she wore a scarlet ribbon round her forelock, whatever that piece is. She appeared to be enjoying herself, so the pigeon said. None of the animals ever mentioned Molly again. In January, there came obliteratingly hard weather. The earth was like iron, and nothing could be done in the fields. Many meetings were held in the big barn, and the pigs occupied themselves with planning out the work of the coming season. It had come to be accepted that the pigs, who were manifestly cleverer than the other animals, should decide all questions of farm policy. Though their decisions had to be ratified by a majority vote, this arrangement would have worked well enough if it had not been for disputes between Snowball and Napoleon. These two disagreed at every point where disagreement was possible. If one of them suggested sowing a bigger acreage with barley, the other was certain to demand a bigger acreage of oats, and none of them said that such a field was just right for cabbages. The other would declare that it was useless for anything except roots. Each had his own following, and there were some violent debates. At the meetings, Snowball often won over the majority with his brilliant speeches, but Napoleon was better at canvassing support for himself in between times. He was especially successful with the sheep. Of late, the sheep had been taking to bleating 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, both in and out of season, and they often interrupted the meetings with this. It was noticed that they were especially liable to break into 4 legs good, 2 legs bad at crucial moments in Snowball's speeches. Snowball had made the close study of some back numbers of The Farmer and the Stock Breeder, which he had found in the farmhouse, and was full of plans for innovations and improvements. Oh, there was no period there. He talked learningly about field drain silage and basic slag, and had worked out a complicated scheme for all the animals to drop their dung directly into the field at a different spot every day to save the labor of cartridge. Or cartage. Napoleon produced no schemes of his own, but said quietly that snowballs would come to nothing and seemed to be biding his time. But all their controversies, none was so bitter as the one that took the place over the windmill. In the long pasture not far from the farm buildings, there was a small knoll, which at its highest point on the farm. After surveying the ground, Snowball declared that this was just the place for a windmill, which could be made to operate a dynamo and supply the farm with electrical power. That's not going to go well. This would light the stalls and warm them in the winter, which would also run a circular saw, a shaft cutter, a mangle slicer, and an electric milking machine. The animals had never heard of anything of this kind before, for the farm was old-fashioned one, and had the milking machine, and had only the most primitive machinery, and they listened in astonishment while Snowball conjured up pictures of fantastic machines which would do their work for them while they grazed at their ease in the fields or improved their minds with reading conversation. Okay, I think I know why in this book the humans are the king of all animals. They actually know that windmills can't power such things. Within a few weeks, well, that doesn't mean they're not smart. Within a few weeks, Snowball's plans for the windmill were fully worked out. The mechanical details came mostly from 3 books which had belonged to Mr. Jones, 1,000 Useful Things to Do About the House, Everyday Man, Own Bricklayer, and Electricity for Beginners. Snowball used as his study a shed which had once been used for incubators and had a smooth wooden floor suitable for drawing on. He was cloistered there for hours at a time, with his books held open by a stone and with a piece of chalk gripped between the knuckles of his trotter. He would move more rapidly and fro, drawing line after line, uttering little whimpers of excitement. Gradually, the plans grew into a complicated mass of cranks and cogwheels, covering more than half the floor, which the other animals found completely unintelligible, but were very impressive. All of them came to look at Snowball's drawings at least once a day. Even the hens and ducks came, and were at pains not to tread on the chalk marks. Only Napoleon held aloof. He had declared himself against the windmill from the start. One day, however, he arrived unexpectedly to examine the plans. He walked heavily around the shed, looked very closely at each detail of the plans, and snuffled at them once or twice, then stood for a little while contemplating them out for the corner of his eye. Then suddenly he lifted his leg, urinated all over the plants, and walked out without uttering a word. My man. The whole farm was deeply divided on the subject of the windmill. Yes. The windmill. Snowball did not deny that to build it would be a different business. Stone would have to be carried up and built up into walls, and then the sails would have to be made after that and would need for dynamos and cables. However, these were to be procured. Snowball did not say, or how these were supposed to be. But he maintained that it could be done in a year, and thereafter he declared so much labor would be saved that the animals would only need to work 3 days a week. Napoleon, on the other hand, argued that a great need of the moment would to increase food production, and if they were wasted the time on the windmill, they would starve to death. The animals formed themselves into 2 factions under the slogans "Vote for Snowball" and 3-Day Wreck, and "Vote for Napoleon" and "The Full Manager." Benjamin was the only mammal who did not side with either faction. Benjamin is Switzerland. He refused to believe that either food would become more plentiful or that the windmill would save work. Windmill or no windmill, he said life would go on as it always had. That is, badly. Apart from the disputes over the windmill, there was the question of the defense of the farm. It was fully realized that though the humans beings had been defeated in the Battle of the Cowshed, they might take another and more determined attempt to recapture the farm and reinstate Mr. Jones. They had all the more reason for doing so, because news of their defeat had spread across the countryside and made the animals on the neighboring farms even more restive than ever. As usual, Snowball and Napoleon were in disagreement. A According to Napoleon, what the animals must do was to procure firearms and train themselves in use of them. According to Snowball, they must send out more and more pigeons to stir rebellion among the animals on the other farms. The one argued that if rebellions happened everywhere, they would have no need to defend themselves. The animals listened up to first to Napoleon, then to Snowball. They could not make up their minds which was right. Indeed, they always found themselves in agreement with the one who was speaking at the moment. At the last day came when Snowball's plans were completed. At the meetings on the following Sunday, the question of whether or not to begin work on the windmill was put to the vote. When the animals assembled, how long is this chapter? Jesus Christ. In the big barn, Snowball stood up short. All right. Big barn. Snowball stood up and, through occasionally interrupted by bleating from the sheep, set forth his reasons for advocating the building of the windmill. Then Napoleon stood up to reply. He said very quietly that the windmill was nonsense, and they advertised nobody to vote for it, and promptly sat down again. He had spoken for barely 30 seconds, and seemed almost indifferent as to the effect he had produced. At this, Snowball sprang to his feet, shouting down the sheep, who had begun bleating again, broke into a passionate appeal in the favor of the windmill. Until now, the animals had been absolutely equally divided in their sympathies, but in a moment Snowball's eloquence had carried them away. In glowing sentences, he painted a picture of Animal Farm as might be when sordid labor was lifted from the animals' backs. His imagination had now run far beyond chaff cutters and turnip slicers. Electricity, he said, could operate threshing machines, plows, harrows, rollers, reapers, and binders, besides supplying every stall with its own electric light, hot and cold water, with an electric heater. By the time he had finished speaking, there was no doubt which way the vote would go. Clearly, Napoleon's going to win. But just as this moment, Napoleon stood up and, casting a particular sidelong look at Snowball's udder and high-pierced whimper to a kind of that no one had ever heard him utter before. At this, there was a terrible bang sound outside, and 9 enormous dogs wearing brass-studded colors came bounding into the barn. They dashed straight forward Snowball, who only sprang from his place just in time to escape their snapping jaws. In a moment, he was out of the door, and they were after him. Too amazed and frightened to speak, all the animals crowded through the door to watch the chase. Snowball was racing across the long pasture that led to the road. He was running as only a pig can run, but the dogs were close on his heels. Suddenly, he slipped, and it seemed certain that they had him. Then he was up again, running faster than ever. Then the dogs were gaining on him again. One of them all but closed his jaws with Snowball's tail, but Snowball whisked free just in time. Then he put an extra spurt in, and with a few inches to spare, slipped through a hole in the hedge and was seen no more. Silent and terrified, the animals crept back into the barn. In a moment, the dogs came bounding back. At first, no one had been able to imagine where these creatures came from, but the problem was still solved. They were puppies whom Napoleon had taken away from their mothers and reared privately. Though not full-grown wolves, they kept close to Napoleon. It was noticed that they wagged their tails to him in the same way as the other dogs had been used to Mr. Jones. Napoleon, with the dogs following him now, mounted and raised the portion of the floor where the major had previously stood to deliver a speech. He announced that from now on, Sunday morning meetings would come to an end. They were unnecessary, he said, and wasted time. In the future, all questions relating to the working of the farm would be settled by a special committee of pigs presided over by himself. These would meet in private and afterwards communicate their decisions to others. The animals would still assemble on Sunday mornings to salute the flag and sing Beasts of England, which had received their orders from the week. But there would be no more debates, in spite of the shock that Snowball's expulsion had given them. The animals dismayed by this time announcement. Several of them would have protested if they could have found the right arguments. Even Foxer was vaguely troubled. He set his ears back, shook his forelock several times, and tried hard to marshal his thoughts. But in the end, he could not think of anything to say. Some of the pigs themselves, however, were more articulate. 4 young porkers in the front now uttered shrill sequels of disapproval, and all 4 of them sprang to their feet and began speaking at once. But suddenly, the dogs sitting around Napoleon left out deep, menacing growls, and the pigs fell silent and sat down. Dang, Napoleon's just stalling. That's nice. Again. Then the sheep broke into a tremendous bleating. 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. which went on for nearly a quarter of an hour before put to an end to any chance of discussion. Afterwards, Squealer was sent around the farm to explain the new arrangement to others. "Comrades," he said, "I trust that every animal here appreciates the sacrifice that Comrade Napoleon has made in taking this extra labor upon himself. Do not imagine, comrades, that the leadership is a pleasure. On the contrary, it's deep and heavy responsibility. No one believes more firmly than Comrade Napoleon all animals are equal. He would be only too happy to let you make your decisions for yourself. But sometimes you might make the wrong decisions, comrades. And then where should we be? Suppose you had decided to follow Snowball with his moonshine of windmills. Snowball, as we all know now, was no better than a criminal. He fought bravely at the Battle of Cowshed," said someone. "Bravery is not enough," said Squealer. "Loyalty and obedience is more important. Is that at the Battle of the Cowshed, I believe that the time will come when we shall find that Snowball's part was, and it was much more exaggerated. Discipline, comrades, iron discipline. That is the watchword for today. One false step, and our enemies would please be quiet. Be back upon us. Surely, comrades, you do not want Jones back." Once again, this argument was unswearable. Certainty that the animals did not want Jones back. The holding of debates on Sunday morning was liable to bring it back. Then the debates must stop. Boxer, who had now had time to think things over, voiced in general feeling, but said, "Comrade Napoleon says it. It must be right." And from then on, he adopted the maxim. The maxim? He has a machine gun. That's odd. Napoleon was right, in addition to his private motto of "I will work harder." By this time, the weather had broken and the spring plowing had begun. The shed where Snowball had drawn his plans of the windmill had been shut up, and it was assumed the plan was off the floor. Every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, the animals assembled in the big barn to receive the orders for the week. The skull of old Major, now clean of flesh, had been from the orchid and set up on a stump at the foot of the flagstaff, besides a gun. After the hoisting of the flag, the animals were required to file past the skull in a reverent manner before entering the barn. Nowadays, they did not sit all together as they had done in the past. Napoleon with Squealer, another pig named Minimus, who had a remarkable gift for composing songs and poems, sat on the front of the raised platform with 9 young dogs forming a semicircle around them. Then the other pigs sitting behind. The rest of the animals sat facing them in the main body of the barn. Napoleon read out the orders for the week of the gruff shoulder style. After a single singing of Beasts of England, all the animals dispersed. On the third Sunday after Snowball's expulsion, the animals were somewhat surprised to hear Napoleon announce that the windmill was to be built after all. He did not give any reason for having changed his mind. He merely warned the animals that this extra task would mean very hard work. It might even be necessary to reduce their rations. The plans, however, had all been prepared down to the last detail. A special committee of pigs had been at work upon them for the past 3 weeks. The building of the windmill, with various other improvements, was expected to take 2 years. That evening, Squealer explained privately to the other animals that Napoleon had never in reality been opposed to the windmill. On the contrary, it was he who had advocated it in the beginning. And the plan which Snowball had drawn on the floor of the incubator shed had actually been stolen from among Napoleon's papers. The windmill was, in fact, Napoleon's own creation. Why, then, asked someone, had he spoken so strongly against it? Here Squealer looked very sly. Then that, he said, was Comrade Napoleon's cunning. He had seemed to oppose the windmill simply as a maneuver to get rid of Snowball, who was a dangerous character and a bad influence. Now that Snowball was out of the way, the plans could go forward without his interference. This, said Squealer, was something called tactics. He repeated a number of times, "Tactics, comrades, tactics," skipping around and whisking his tail with a merry laugh. The other animals were not certain of what the word meant, but Squealer spoke so persuasively, and the 3 dogs who happened to be with him growled so threateningly, that they accepted his explanation without further questions. Well, that was boring.